Welcome, everyone. This is the Pathways to Permanence Habitat Hammers Back webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. We're very glad that you're here. I'm going to now turn this over to Colleen Ridnour, our Senior Vice President for Development. Colleen?
Thank you so much, Tommy, and thank you all for joining us today to hear about the work that we are doing in the wake of the fall disasters. So I'd like to introduce Jonathan Reckford, who is the CEO of Habitat for Humanity International. He is joining us here in Atlanta. And also Desiree Bartosiak, who is the director of our Habitat Hammers Back initiative. She is actually joining us from the ground in Puerto Rico, having just visited with our colleagues there on the ground in the island. And so we're eager to hear the latest from her straight from the field. So Jonathan and Desiree, I'm going to hand it over to you to give us the latest update.
Thank you, Colleen. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And a special thanks to all of you who in so many ways have supported our efforts to help Habitat hammer back and support so many families who were hurt by these storms. Last year, Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria created one of the nation's largest housing disasters. Tens of thousands of people were displaced, and the storms cost more than $6.7 billion in damages across Texas, Florida, and Puerto Rico. Texas faces more than $2.1 billion in housing damages, and an estimated 150,000 properties were affected by Harvey. In Florida, Hurricane Irma caused more than $400 million worth of housing damage, and housing casualties in Puerto Rico totaled more than $4.1 billion. Months of extended power outages and difficulty in delivering supplies to the island compounded the disaster conditions on the ground.
So as everyone can see, there's been quite a bit of damage from these hurricanes, and what we'd like to do now is hear from you what your reaction is to these numbers. This is the first opportunity for you to chat in the chat box. So hearing about the massive devastation that we've heard about, what's your response to that? Please type something in the chat box. We'll give just a moment for that. All right, I'm not hearing it, not seeing anything in the chat box just yet. Now we are. Not surprised. From Sean Kale, Pat Nakoff says very distressing then and now. You're absolutely right. So let's go ahead and continue, and we're going to turn it over to Desiree now.
Thanks, Tommy. In the wake of the storms, local habitat organizations took quick action, aiding thousands of families with immediate recovery efforts. As of February, habitat organizations have provided more than 10,000 disaster relief and recovery services in Texas and Florida, including emergency repairs, home cleanouts, case management assistance, and debris removal. Within weeks of Hurricane Maria's landfall in Puerto Rico, Habitat partnered with Save the Children to distribute 2,000 shelter repair kits and also 2,000 solar repair kits to help families access electricity. We're happy to report that over 95% of the recipients said they used the kits to make repairs, and 58% were able to make successful repairs, avoiding displacement.
Habitat organizations in Texas and Florida have assisted families with more than 500 construction projects, including repairs, rehabs, or new homes. New home construction and permanent repairs in Puerto Rico will begin this spring.
Habitat is committed to helping families work through every step of the process to have safe and decent places to live. Within this recovery effort, Habitat for Humanity International seeks to support local affiliates with funding and technical assistance, as well as capacity building. Habitat has brought together a team of experts to develop a comprehensive disaster recovery strategy that delivers high-quality disaster response programs at scale. All our interventions are designed to help families move towards a future where they have long-term solutions to their shelter needs, or as we call this at Habitat, pathways to permanence. As we scale up our efforts, we are also seeking to help affiliates grow so they can match the increased effort with strong internal controls, adequate staffing, and best internal practices.
Helping affected U.S. families recover from disasters is an urgent but complex priority for our organization and others. Disasters almost always disrupt local infrastructure and services. For those families with insurance coverage or support from local or national emergency organizations, it's vital that they leverage any and all benefits available to them before complementary services can begin. Specialized contractors who provide services like mold remediation often find they're overwhelmed by the number of people needing their help. For example, the number of mold remediation treatments that we assumed were needed has doubled and tripled due to the severity of the flooding, increasing the workload on our contractors even more. Our work to help families has to allow for and respect both the needs of those affected and the realities of the situation. We're going to share with you some very distinct stages of response and what activities we've undertaken for each one.
Immediately after the storms, we focused on relief efforts. These included conducting rapid damage assessments and collecting data to prioritize repairs, removing debris and performing emergency repairs, working with local habitat organizations to assess their capacity for long-term recovery work, and coordinating with other responders and long-term recovery groups.
Shortly after Hurricane Harvey, when I first met Vicki and her 9-year-old daughter Aaliyah in Texas, they just wanted to put their lives back together. The first thing that struck me as I was ripping out drywall and trim in Aaliyah's room was the jumble of ruined possessions strewn on the floor: stuffed animals, playing cards, math workbooks, and a basketball. Vicki wanted us to try to save her dishes and whatever shoes we could, which we carefully did, along with a few family photos. Realized that this family and so many others were going to have to start over. I told her that Habitat would be there and that we'd walk beside her and the other families for as long as it takes. And we know, unfortunately, that the recovery from these major disasters is measured in years, not months.
As the emergency conditions subsided, we translated into early recovery activities, such as providing guidance to affected families on insurance claims and applications for government assistance, determining gaps in funding for repairs and construction, dispersing funds to local habitat organizations to support repairs and other interventions, and designing long-term rebuilding plans. We emphasize that Habitat will be present to help families long after other organizations have left, but it's critical that we mobilize to help families in the early recovery as well.
We're now concentrating on long-term recovery to bring repair and reconstruction plans to scale. This phase will be the longest and the most expensive, and will include rehabilitating and repairing houses with an emphasis on resilience to help homes withstand future disasters, constructing new affordable housing to help alleviate intensified economic pressures that have driven up the cost of housing, mobilizing volunteers from around the country, and engaging in collaborative partnerships with other recovery organizations, providing technical assistance and working together to renew communities.
Thank you both, Jonathan and Desiree. We come now to a place where we'd like to hear from you. What do you think about these strategies and challenges you've just heard about? And while I give you a minute to think about those, let me scroll back up and tell you all, Jonathan and Desiree especially, that Anna commented after we talked about the devastation that this is the largest cumulative disaster season that she's ever worked through, and it made many existing crises worse. So it has been a devastating experience for folks in Florida, Texas, and Puerto Rico. So as you see both the devastation and then you hear about the strategies that Habitat has employed to respond, what do you think about this? Let me give you a moment to put something in the chat box. And you may not be able to see what others write. We've discovered that just a few minutes ago, but I will share whatever shows up in the chat box with everyone. Jonathan, Brenda says that you mentioned a focus on sustainability and resilient building. Can you share more about the resiliency tactics and strategies?
Thanks, Brenda. Absolutely. And, you know, I might hold that because it may fit a little bit better if we come back through, but we will absolutely talk about that because it is important. We know, unfortunately, that disasters are going to keep on happening, and often low-income families are in the most vulnerable places. And so it's really important that we think about long-term resilience. We also find it's far more economically efficient to invest in resilience than in fixing the problems after the storm. Depending on the study, 5 or 6 or even 7 times as efficient to put $1 into shoring up or creating a resilient strategy for the family, the home, or the community versus waiting until the disaster happens and then coming back and having to do the fix.
Yes, there will be a time, as Jonathan mentioned, holding that. There will be a time when we get to the end where we'll have opportunities for you to ask other questions and to make additional comments. Let me do one more here. Anna says that she's curious about the cost of housing rebuilds in Florida and Puerto Rico. Know it's very costly and there are lots of land rights issues. Can you talk about any additional support needed for land rights and how the overall high cost issues is being addressed in those areas? I'm sorry, I had to scroll.
Thank you. You know, I'll let maybe Desiree can talk about Puerto Rico. Land is a huge issue everywhere in the world for housing, and one of the biggest challenges are in different ways. In Houston, there's some issues about whether some places should be rebuilt because we know now that they're in fragile areas that are going to flood again in the future. And so there's some hard conversations about whether it makes sense to build back in flood-prone areas. I think Florida is more wind damage, so there's some of the same issues, but it's mostly repair or ongoing traditional habitat construction. And Puerto Rico is by far the most complex on that issue. And Desiree, do you want to share a little more about the challenge of land tenure and titling?
Sure. So we are seeing soaring costs in Puerto Rico right now, frankly, because of supply chain issues, as well as land issues in terms of the cost of land. In terms of land title, it is a critical issue. I've actually been at all-day Reimagining Puerto Rico conference that will work on a commission to create some clear deliverables as well as policy recommendations to the government. As well as you should know that one of Habitat's pillars in Puerto Rico moving forward with our programming will focus on tenure. Less than 0.5, so not even 1%, guys, of the island has tenure and is built to code. There's a long road ahead to help Puerto Rico recover.
Clearly some major hurdles to overcome. A couple of comments that have come in and some other questions. Pat has said, likes the fact that long-term commitment and resiliency too, and looking at new affordable housing, commenting on our commitment to do those things. Fo Ching says, has the current administration FEMA's policy posed additional challenges for our work, Habitat's work, especially for Puerto Rico? Desiree, why don't you take that one since it's about Puerto Rico?
Sure. Well, one of the key things I'll highlight is the significant amount of funding that HUD is actually allocated for Puerto Rico within the CDBG DR system. We had about $1.5 billion allocated previously in terms of some of the previous announcements, and then another announcement's come out today, and I can't quote the number off the top of my head right now. So while we are seeing significant support for Puerto Rico in terms of financing and other key aspects, we do not, though, know that there's some key challenges. For example, in order to access that CDBG DR funding, as we talked about earlier, you must have land tenure. And there's some key other crucial things such as environmental assessments and other costly aspects to access that funding. So to let you guys know, Habitat's working very hard in terms of advocacy. I can tell you personally, I've met with HUD and FEMA, not only at the federal level, but the regional level, as well as the local level in Texas, Florida, and Puerto Rico. We're on top of it, and we are advocating for affordable housing and recovery every step of the way.
Thank you. Let me share one more comment, and then there are, I think, some other questions, and I will capture those so that we'll have them to start our question and answer time toward the end. Sean says, thanks for sharing. It's great that Habitat has done all of this so far, and there's a commitment to do more. Our employees who are so dedicated to Habitat in their homes would love to know more about the way Habitat responds in disasters, especially as we think forward about the next hurricane season. How can companies be most helpful to these programs, such as the continuing recovery in Puerto Rico?
It's a great question. Thank you. And a couple things, sort of the principal level, one thing we really encourage our partners to think about is allocating some funds for the relief effort, but then reserving hopefully a significant amount of the funding for the long-term recovery as well. What we see traditionally is about 80% of the resources go to the relief effort, and the relief effort is crucial, but then there's not enough money for the very long and expensive recovery effort. So thinking about kind of a multi-stage approach to support could be really helpful. And then there's so many different ways and so many needs for partnership. But I do think the other thing for forward-thinking partners is thinking about resilience. And we've got examples from very low-income contexts and high-income contexts about where we can invest. For instance, in Miami, where we know they're going to have future storms, we did a major initiative just to put good storm shutters on all the low-income housing, which dramatically reduces then the damage done when the next storm hits. And there are other examples like that of relatively low-cost interventions that can significantly reduce the damage in places that we know will eventually have storms. And so, and we could talk more about that.
Well, thanks. Let's go ahead and move on. We've got just a couple more slides, and then we'll have a time for more Q&A. I believe, Jonathan, it's back to you.
Great. Thank you, Tommy. So Habitat has many years of experience in helping communities recover after major disasters. We know recovery requires commitment, funding, and tenacity long after the floodwaters drain and the TV cameras leave. We find that the media cycle is days or weeks. The recovery cycle can be between 5 and 15 years, depending on the scale of the disaster. Since 1999, Habitat has helped more than 230,000 families in 52 countries through our disaster response work. And Desiree helped lead many of our response efforts around the world.
We're coordinating recovery work with governmental and non-governmental organizations, including FEMA and the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. As I spoke earlier about, we're also working very hard with HUD to influence policies and frameworks that will best aid housing recovery. These partnerships allow Habitat to share best practices and target our recovery work where it is needed most.
So we've thrown a lot of facts and figures at you. We close by just telling you a brief story about real people who were affected by the storm in Florida. Carlos and Alina built their Habitat home in Highlands County, Florida 8 years ago. For the first time, they were able to put down roots. When Hurricane Irma soaked the kids' pink and yellow bedrooms, some of the volunteers returned to help with repairs. Volunteers asked family members if they remembered them. Carlos responded, "Of course, you helped us build our home." Alina said that she was touched because Habitat hadn't forgotten that the kids, Adriana and Adrian, now 12 and 10, suffer with severe asthma. The children have been staying with relatives because dampness can trigger an attack. Getting their home dry and repaired means the family can be back together. Habitat not only cared for us and helped us go through the process of becoming homeowners, Alina said, but to see that they're still there for us is something I hold near to my heart. I think that says a huge amount about why we do this work. And actually, there was a real debate about should Habitat do disaster work that didn't fit with many people's conception of Habitat. But as I mentioned earlier, what we've seen when these disasters happen is that the people living in the worst conditions in the poorest quality housing always get hurt the most in disasters. So helping them rebuild seemed to be completely on mission for us. And any given year, anywhere between 15 and 30% of our global work is now permanent recovery work or long-term rebuilding from disasters.
Absolutely, Jonathan. I mean, I think of the fact that these families wouldn't be in this situation right now if their homes were resilient. So that just means that the successful long-term recovery of Texas, Florida, and Puerto Rico is going to require sustained level of supports. Habitat's goal is to raise $100 million. As Jonathan mentioned earlier, 80% of the funds traditionally raised by disaster response agencies go into those emergency relief efforts. But Habitat's here for the long term, and we're depending on volunteers and donors to help us meet those long-term goals. We appreciate and very much need your support.
Again, I want to thank those of you who are supporting our Habitat Hammers Back initiative. I want to encourage the rest of you to consider ways you might help us and join our efforts to help communities build back stronger. So we want to take the rest of the time to come back to your questions, make sure we're love to hear your feedback. So use the chat feature, and Tommy will coordinate, but we're happy to talk about anything you want to talk about.
Yeah, so what questions do you have that you'd share with us? You can type those in the chat box. There was a comment, Des, about the stat you said about the less than 1%, that is a crazy stat in terms of the land tenure there in Puerto Rico. So what questions do you have that Jonathan or Desiree can answer for you? While you type, I'm going to, again, scroll through some slides of the different places. And we'll do that, and also watch the chat box and share any questions that you have. So we have about 6 or 7 minutes left in the time schedule for this, so that's plenty of time for some questions.
I'll just, while they're coming in, go back to Brenda's question about resilience, and also make comment, building on Desiree's comments about Puerto Rico. Sometimes I think we only think about volunteers coming to do construction. There actually, there'll be some interesting opportunities. For instance, I think one opportunity in Puerto Rico may be skilled legal volunteers who can come and work with us. There's going to be a policy effort, but after that, a huge effort to actually have to work with families to help them get documentation so they can access the funding. And so I think there, as we get clearer on the plan, that's going to open up some different opportunities for volunteers to come and bring their different gifts to help problem solve and help families build back. It is, and I think excellent. On the, go ahead, Kami.
Yeah, I was going to say, we had a question from Fo Chung. He said the problems are so large and costly. Can small funders still make a difference?
Thank you. It's a great question. The answer is actually yes, and particularly for Habitat, it can make a difference. One of the things we often find is that some of the large grants, and especially government funds, are incredibly tightly restricted and have all kinds of conditions. And sometimes we also need matching funds. So actually flexible gifts that are designated loosely to the hurricane response, but allow us then to fill the gaps, are incredibly valuable and sort of disproportionately valuable, because some of the big gifts come with extreme restrictions on exactly where they can go and what they can be used for. And so we find our small donors giving us flexible funding have allowed us to be a little bit more agile in meeting the unexpected needs and filling the gaps where sometimes all the money gets designated to places that have some need, but then other areas of high need get left out, and that allows us to shift some of that around as well. So it all helps.
Okay. A couple of questions have come in about advocacy. One, just in general, is there an advocacy effort that people can be involved with? Let me be sure I'm getting that question correct. Yes, and is there advocacy that can be done around the land issues, primarily in Puerto Rico?
So I will, the answer is yes and yes. There's sort of multiple levels. First of all, there's advocacy level at the local, state, and federal level around support for disaster recovery and broader support for housing and getting housing as a higher priority. Within it, then there are even still policy issues where advocacy can be valuable. Puerto Rico's extreme case, without going into tons of detail, and I'll turn it to Desiree to elaborate, you actually have a uniquely complex situation in Puerto Rico with Spanish law overlapping with U.S. building codes that really make it very risky for any developer or builder to come in and try to do repair or rehab, because they have to take a home that was never built to code and bring it up to code if they touch it, and the architect is then fully liable for that home. So it makes the repair work really complex, and I think we're going to have advocacy to figure out a policy that doesn't handcuff not just Habitat, but the building community from coming in and helping families who are living in places that were never properly built. Desiree, do you want to add to that?
I think you capitalized on it really great, Jonathan. I think the one thing I would just add is to say that Habitat is very hard at work on advocacy across the board. And interesting enough, guys, it's even in Texas, we've seen some tenure issues. So while we think about Puerto Rico as being unique, in a disaster context, there's a lot of challenges across the board. I can talk to you about, for example, in Highlands County, it's one of our affiliate operational bases in Florida. It was one of the most socioeconomic depressed areas in Florida before the storms hit, aged population, and CDBG-DR funding won't hit them directly. So we did a massive advocacy. Experts say we need to focus funds on there at a state level, not even a federal level, because we need to have those folks that are aging in place as well be on the forefront of folks' thoughts.
That's a great example. When I first joined Habitat, Hurricane Katrina hit, which until this recent round was the biggest large-scale housing disaster in recent U.S. history. And we did see in both Louisiana and Mississippi families that had been in their homes for generations but did not have legal title or couldn't get their hands on any kind of legal title. And we had to help them navigate that process so that they could then get insurance benefits or federal aid.
Let me ask one more question. It comes from Eric. He says, how will you inform funders of the volunteer opportunities in Puerto Rico, like the skilled legal opportunity, Jonathan, that you mentioned?
Thanks, Eric. It's a great question. And we will be actually eager once we're ready to come back. One of the most awkward things for us has been the overwhelming number of people who were ready already to go to Puerto Rico before the infrastructure was there. So up to now, as many of you know, the power was down, the communications were down, there's no place for people to stay, and there were no conditions where people, unskilled volunteers, could actually come and be helpful. That will change over time. And so the key is initially we had volunteers, but only what we would call the professional skilled volunteers coming in. And then as we get to the rebuilding phase, which is slower in Puerto Rico for all the reasons I just mentioned, there will be then opportunities for volunteerism, and we certainly will reach out to our partners as we identify those. So it's I think in sequencing, Florida was the easiest to come back, though even there, it's a whole lot of roof repair, and so it's finding the right opportunities. Texas will have, sadly, a ton of work to do for a very long time because the sheer number of flooded homes, and then Puerto Rico will be the slowest. But then there will be long-term opportunities to come in and support. And I do think actually when we think about skilled volunteers, it's where often we believe our corporate partner network could be incredibly valuable once we've got clarity around what's needed and more precision on what the plan is. So keep posted. We will let you know. I know it can be frustrating. Right at the beginning, everybody wants to come and help. And I can't tell you how eager we are to get going, but it's also critical that we do it the right way, and that we both have the conditions to keep people safe. That and Haiti was a great example of this too. Sometimes if you bring volunteers in too soon, they actually consume the resources that are desperately needed by the families in Puerto Rico. So you don't want to take away food, housing, and water away from Puerto Rican families by bringing extra folks who have need in. So first we've got to get conditions stable, use the professional recovery folks or relief folks, and then as we move into long-term recovery, it'll actually then hopefully help the economy, where we can start bringing people in who can then bring much needed money to the island as well as their skills.
Let us stop there because we've reached the end of the time allotted. There was a question about the handouts. Someone was not seeing them. So just a reminder that there is a pane on your control panel called Materials. There should be 4 handouts there. But we will also commit to you that we will send the handouts out through email to everyone who actually showed up on the webinar today. We'll have a report of that, so we'll be sure that you get those. Let me turn it back over to Colleen and let her bring us to a close.
Thank you so much, Tommy. Thank you, Desiree and Jonathan, for giving us the update this afternoon. And thank all of you for joining us and carving out some time this afternoon to learn more about our Habitat Hammersback initiative. It is because of you and your support that we have been able to help the families that we've been able to help so far, and all of the families that we have yet to be able to help. As you heard from Jonathan and Desiree, it is a very long road ahead, a multi-year effort that we have ahead of us, and we are so grateful that you are with us along for the journey. So thank you, thank you, thank you. On behalf of the entire Habitat Network, and specifically our affiliates in Texas and Florida and Puerto Rico and the families that we are serving there, we are so grateful for your support. If you have any questions whatsoever, please reach out to your Habitat Development Officer. We are here to work alongside you to continue to hammer back over the years to come. And as Tommy mentioned, those reports are available in the screen there, and we will send them out via email, and we look forward to partnering with you over the coming years to continue to serve these families. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to doing that.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. That is the end of the webinar.
Muchas gracias.